Hello everyone and welcome to Makai-World Reviews. I am the Tony Makai, Master of Minds and of Men, and this month I am back on track. We'll be looking at, in the month of March, mockumentaries. That's right, fake, usually comedic, but not always documentaries. We're going to start off with a doozy, that is, What We Do in the Shadows. I'm excited for all of these this month, genuinely, so let's go ahead and get a flat together and see what happens. What's that movie again? Well, it's What We Do in the Shadows, the movie, not the television show. It was directed, written, and starring two men, one by the name of Jermaine Clement, a man who has seemingly boundless talent for directing, writing, music, acting, voice work, etc. From his band Flight of the Conchords, to the underrated Gentleman Broncos, to the voice of Sauron himself, and on and on. A highly talented man that I really like, and whom has a damn great voice, too. And Taika Waititi, man who I kind of like more as an actor than as a director, but I'll get to that later. Of course, he has Jojo Rabbit under his belt, which is a great movie, but he also has the disappointing Eagle vs. Shark, several mediocre Thor movies, and little else to speak of. Though I do like his writing on Reservation Dogs, I just tend to think he's a bit overrated. The release date, I always go by the US release, of course, if I can, and it was February 13th, 2015. What came out around the same time? 50 Shades of Grey. I am sure you're all familiar with the popular date rape advocacy film 50 Shades of Grey. From book to movie, I'm sure there's a play version or a board game or something, just awful tripe. And the rewrite. Hugh Grant and my girl Marissa Tomei do their best in uninspired and undeveloped romantic comedy flop. Add that to their lists. Moving over to the plot, now I mentioned this is a mockumentary, which is a fake documentary, as is the style of the month here. This is presented as being at least paid for by the New Zealand Documentary Board, and they are following a group of vampires who live there, and the events leading up to a gathering of ghouls that happens every few years, entitled the Unholy Masquerade. And who are these vampires? I'll go into detail about their personalities and eccentricities later. But we have Viago, Vladislav the Poker, Deacon, and Peter. Thus we follow these dark specters of the night and their lives in New Zealand. Dishes are done. They go out in the town with varying degrees of difficulties, especially because they have to be invited into clubs. So they usually end up at their usual haunts. They also find victims, deal with other vampires around the town, and even a pack of werewolves that we'll see a little bit later. Vladislav has seemingly been damaged emotionally and physically by an entity he calls the Beast, which has weakened his powers from their once great height. Viago has a lady love that time has passed by. He arrived too late to prevent her from getting married, and she is elderly now, yet he still yearns for her. Deacon has a familiar, Jackie, who wishes to be turned into a vampire, as all familiars do, but Deacon has been leading her on for years. Well, he has also demanded her find them some virgins to eat, which proves to be a much larger task than originally thought, as she ends up with a man she dated when they were both 12, Nick, and a woman she disliked in school, Josephine, both of which are not virgins. Now, why virgins, you may ask? Vladislav makes this clear. If you were going to eat a sandwich, you would just enjoy it more if you knew no one had fucked it. I can agree with that. After some taunting by the boys to their victims, including a Lost Boys joke about eating worms, Josephine is presumed killed and Nick has been turned into a vampire by Peter. We see the trauma Nick endured before becoming a full-fledged vampire, bleeding from the eyes, his reflection being out of sync, feeling freezing cold and burning hot, and climbing on the ceiling. But in time he becomes reasonably accepted by our crew, sans Deacon, who feels his place as the young, cool vampire is being usurped. But everyone else seems to embrace Nick, which is helped by the fact he can get them into the cool clubs. He also has a friend, Stu, a human that he has opened up about being a vampire to, and the reddest man alive, who helps the group come into the 21st century. Stu sets up their TV, internet, cell phones, and digital cameras so they can finally see themselves on a regular basis. Stu is much loved. But Nick makes a huge faux pas when he won't stop bragging to everyone about being a vampire, and runs afoul of a vampire hunter, and this gets Peter killed. This causes a physical fight between Deacon and Nick is banished. Things essentially return to normal as the boys prepare for the unholy masquerade. But another spanner is thrown into the works when Vladislav finds out the person being celebrated at the masquerade is the Beast, his ex-girlfriend, as it turns out. and he becomes a bit of a recluse. But the rest go to the ball where we find Nick, who has brought Stu, a human, and also has turned Deacon's now former familiar into a vampire. Well, Stu is found out, and the Beast and her ilk want to kill him. But thanks to Vladislav's arrival, and Stu being quick with a flagpole, the group escape, but run afoul of the werewolf group on the full moon, and Stu is killed, as is one of the documentary crew. In the end, though, Stu is alive, just now a werewolf. Viago has turned Catherine into a vampire so they can be together. Vladislav and the Beast are back together, much to everyone's chagrin, and Jackie's husband is now her familiar, with the post-credit scene of Deacon trying to hypnotize us to forget the whole thing. Now let's talk about this movie, and we'll start with directing, as we usually do. I have some issues with Taika Waititi, as he can be up his own ass more often than not, but that does not dispel his ability to be a very talented director. Jojo Rabbit, Boy, and of course this are all very well done, with Jojo being a film well above the others in my opinion, while Eagle vs. Shark and his Marvel fare stink of ego, pretension, and laziness, honestly. Though his upcoming film, Clara and the Sun, I am genuinely excited for, as that was a very decent and emotional novel. But here, I don't feel any of the issues I might take with certain future projects. Directing here is on point. Making a mockumentary is not the easiest of movies to make, as sometimes the lead can get buried, turns into just a movie with a shaky cam or a lost footage type movie. People behind the camera are referenced, questioned, even killed, and that small touch really adds a lot. Most of the people in this are not big-name actors, and besides Jermaine Clement and Taika himself, probably won't ever really be all that well-known outside of their home country. But everyone was utilized perfectly here, as is a director's job, and despite some slightly dodgy acting, solid, well above par directing from Mr. Waititi. Moving over to the cinematography, I think is another solid. The house they all lived in seems adequately spooky inside, but unassuming enough outside, because they have neighbors that live on both sides of them, as we're told. As well as the usage of the city of Wellington in New Zealand as a good portion of the actual city. It was great. It felt as alive as a New Zealand city can be. And I have a friend who visited Wellington not long ago and could point out the accuracy of all the places they visited, within reason. The movie kept its gothic look and appeal up the entire time, with great lighting and atmosphere that clashed in the most appropriate of times. These aged vampires against the modern world. I was never taken out of the world, and I am glad it wasn't terribly varied set-wise, because all of these characters are kind of people that don't stray too far from their comfort zone. As far as the story, it wasn't necessarily one cohesive story, and it really shouldn't be, because that's not how people live their lives. It was a collective of a bunch of things going on in a reasonably small circle of friends or acquaintances that affected one another, however mildly it may be. Plot that takes center stage is about Nick and Deacon, both of them coming to terms with the other. Beyond that, most of the other stories are fairly minor. Viago and Catherine's love story, who or what is the Beast and why does it affect Vladislav? Jackie wanting to become a vampire, the werewolves, not swearwolves, and they all work. This is a comedy movie, and all of these pieces move together, so we don't have a lot of downtime. We don't have a lot of fluff. It's a fairly breezy movie with lots of laughs, but I do have to say the two deaths, or one death and one supposed death of Peter and Stu respectively, both hit hard. Both scenes are given weight and levity, but man, I was really sad to see Peter go. But overall, I try to be more lenient with comedies, though I do expect there to be a solid plot to move the comedy along. And I have no real complaints here. They could have easily made this movie an hour longer and stuff so much more, and I doubt I would have complained then. Of course, the characters where the movie shines for the most part, and let's go over them. Starting with Viago, Taika himself, an 18th century dandy. So as a vampire, he's very fastidious, very particular, but shockingly, one of the more open-minded characters in the movie. He sets a lot of rules for the house, most of which don't get followed, like Deacon not doing the dishes for 5 years. He has nightly routines. He likes to be courteous and polite to his victims, which results usually in a mess, as he is not great at being a vampire. He has a big heart most of the time, as shown by the fact he traveled to New Zealand to be with a woman named Catherine, but thanks to a postage error by a former familiar, he arrives late and she is already married. Thankfully, age is just a number for her, and they can be together in the end. When he turns her into a vampire, of course. Now, I say most of the time because he is dismissive to his former familiar, who has grown old and sad at not being turned into a vampire. And he's very callous about people in general. Though I suppose that's the breaks of being a vampire. You have to have this hierarchical structure that you are at the top of. I believe each of the main 5 vampires represents some kind of time frame of about vampire history in movies, and Viago to me represents the Anne Rice Interview with the Vampire, the soft, feminine vampire of the 90s. To Deacon, the bad boy, the former young vampire. He was a traveling salesman peddling his wares before being turned into a vampire by Peter. He seemingly has the most compelling past, also being a former Nazi vampire before going to New Zealand after World War II. He's emotionally volatile in that he has created this little community for himself, and he doesn't really like when anything changes. He's seemingly the most affected by Nick's inclusion, Peter's death, Stu's seeming death, and much more. Hot-tempered, but not quite as erratic as he would like to seem. He knows following the rules for being a vampire is for the best, and tries to impose that on Nick. I think his vampire movie history lies in the 80s. He even mentioned the Lost Boys, with the grungy, cool vampires, with leather pants and cocky stride. To Vladislav, the poker himself, the most classic-like vampire in the story from the Middle Ages, says he was turned when he was 16, so he always looks 16, though 16 was hard back then. He was a warlord of some description with an epic sex life to boot. He keeps some of this old-school idealism, suggesting at one point that they get some slaves. But he is not the vampire he once was. He talks at length about his fight, seemingly ongoing for a long period, with a creature called the Beast. This fight has left him physically and emotionally scarred, and his powers have waned with his confidence. Come to find out, this Beast was his ex-girlfriend, recontextualizing these fights as domestic spats and bouts of angry sexual congress. Thankfully, his showdown with the Beast near the end seems to instill some of that old fire in him. Sadly, him and the Beast physically reconnect, and that won't end well. Jermaine Clement is brilliant in this, not only as one of the writers, but I think Vladislav is the most entertaining of the vampires. His expressions, body language, and his flowing verbiage all land for me. And his humor, too, of course. Like there's this one scene where he tells the others to leave him alone to do his dark bidding, but it turns out he's just bidding on a table on eBay. I think he represents the Bram Stoker's Dracula type, classic vampire, as well as the movie itself, and it shows some of the visuals, like the women on the bed on the wall, as that's straight from Bram Stoker's Dracula, the movie. To Peter. Straight up, Peter is a Nosferatu. That's what he looks like. That's his aspect of the vampire movie genre. Peter is the more complicated character than his visuals let on. He lives in the basement in a stone tomb. He is harsh to look at. He loves to sleep and feed, and doesn't clean up after himself. He is temperamental, but he likes the company, and is shockingly compassionate. These are shown by the fact that he made at least 2 people in the movie into vampires, Nick and Deacon. Why do that, unless you like having vampires around you, even if you don't spend a ton of time with them? He's also very understanding about Stu, a human hanging around the house. He seems to get that Stu is a vegetarian and doesn't want to hurt living things. Peter's death is the most heartbreaking scene in the movie. R.I.P. Peter. And the werewolves and Stu. We'll start with Stu. He doesn't get a ton of dialogue or anything like that, but he's instrumental in bridging not only the gap between a human friendship to the vampires, but also bringing the boys into the modern age. He is described as the reddest man alive, and this seemingly drives the vampires crazy as he is full of blood. He seemingly kills the Beast's new boyfriend with a flagpole. He becomes a werewolf as a brutal attack during the full moon, thus helping bridge the gap again between the two groups. Now, the werewolves are interesting, as they and their leader, played by the fantastic Rhys Darby, are treated more like a men's emotional support group, which I think is genius. It just makes sense to have a group of emotionally fragile men who turn into monsters when overly aggravated all grouped together to help each other out, and I'm kind of shocked I've not seen that interpretation before. They don't play a huge part in the movie, but the conflict they initially have is interesting, and we get them a little more fleshed out by the end. We also learn they are werewolves, not swearwolves. Moving to the cops, I didn't mention it, but there is a fantastic scene with 2 cops, Officer O'Leary and Officer Minogue, where they are called during the Deacon-Nick fight, though thanks to Viago using his powers, they just give some opinions on the fire hazards in the house. They also have a show together called Wellington Paranormal that went 4 seasons and is a fantastic companion piece to the original movie, along with obviously What We Do in the Shadows, a TV show, though those 2 have less to do with each other. Now, I want to point out the fight choreography was very well done. There was fighting on the ceiling, on the walls, the werewolf stuff. There wasn't a ton of fights, but each of these scenes were superbly put together, honestly. To the soundtrack. As far as the soundtrack, first off, You're Dead by Norma Taniga is brilliant, and I am glad they also use it for the TV show. I was unfamiliar with this song before the movie, and I'm glad I still hear it online in various things like memes. Besides that, this is a shockingly diverse and interesting soundtrack. It ranges from these odd, almost Middle Eastern, creepy tunes to far more light and rhythmic. It definitely added a lot to the experience, and is a good example of a comedy using more serious music effectively. Overall, this is a great comedy, and worth of all the praise it gets. I'm glad this franchise has taken off, with the show being close to its 6th season at the time of recording. Now, I prefer the movie to the show, but I won't ever not praise something with Matt Berry in it. If you're looking for a moderate, dark comedy with characters that are easy to like, I would 100% recommend What We Do in the Shadows. It's just good fun, and great to watch with friends. Hell, even my mom likes this movie. Well, that was week 1 of our mockumentary movie month. What is your favorite vampire in literary history? I have currently been reading the Vampire Hunter D novels. I'm on 5 or 6, and I have to say D is up there, Dampfire or not. Let me know down below, though, and don't forget to come back next week where we'll be looking at Best in Show. Please like, subscribe, add me on Instagram under DemonPeaks for Twin Peaks memes. Lastly, don't forget, I am the only demon who loves you. Thank you, and goodbye.